Today is the second and last session devoted to the Hellenistic Jewish work, The Wisdom of Solomon. Starting with the next session, we're going to be looking at the theme of wisdom as found in New Testament writings. And next Sunday is a kind of a transitional day in that I'll be sharing with you some of the background to the New Testament material that we're going to be exploring. Some of the background is from the Jewish, both biblical and post-biblical world. Some of it is from the Greek world. But then again, most of us have two parents. So if one parent is Hebraic and one parent is Hellenic, that helps us understand what's going on. Secondly, I've been quite impressed with the explicit self-confidence of, and this is a good thing, of inviting critical comment that I've seen in conjunction with this adult formation series. It's a very good thing and it's admirable. So since you now know that we're having our next Take the Pulse session next Sunday afternoon, if you want to spend a little bit of time this week thinking about what you're looking for that perhaps you haven't seen sufficiently, let us know before next Sunday afternoon, and we'll certainly strive to accommodate that, if we can, of course. Okay? Now, turning to today's topic, does everyone have a copy of the handout? It's 2 pages double-sided, total of 4 sides. The main conceptual difficulty involved in today's session is identifying and transcending a very understandable but misleading habit of thought. That habit of thought is to say that since we are in a tradition and we claim continuity with our forebearers, that our thinking and their thinking are in full agreement. It's understandable, it's natural, and it's wrong. So I need to stand on that point just for a moment, and I'd like to use a geographical or spatial analogy to help you think about this. The main north-south highway ever since the Eisenhower administration to go up and down the East Coast is Route 95. Just a quick show of hands, who's been on Route 95? Everyone. Okay, who's been on Route 95 down as far as South Florida? A few, many. Who's been in Route 95 as far north as Maine? A fair number. And has not everyone been on 95 for that extended parking lot that we call Fredericksburg to Springfield? You avoid it whenever possible.
Take the train.
Take the train. Good for you. So here's my my rhetorical question. It's really very easy to answer. Based on the stretch that we live in, you know, Petersburg to the Washington Beltway, okay? Based on that stretch, would you say that 95 generally traverses more or less level terrain rather than climbing mountains? More or less. But is it safe to infer from that what 95 looks like up in Maine? No. And again, we would say that the trees that you see on the margins of 95, in the part that's known to us, tend to be live oak, Virginia pine, right, and so on and so forth. Is it safe to say that those are the trees you would find on Route 95 in Florida? No. So you see, it's perilous to infer that since we are part of a long enduring tradition, that every part that's familiar to us from where we live in that tradition was present in some other part of the tradition, right? Okay, so you see where I'm going with this. We are looking at the roots of Christianity and also, by the way, the roots of Rabbinic Judaism 2,000 years ago. I'm a Rabbinic Jew. You, I expect and hope, are Christians. I have to let Mother Sue weigh in as my expert on that, but it does not follow that everything that you affirm as a Christian in the 21st century is identical to what people affirmed as Christians in the 2nd century, let alone the 1st century. Right? In the 2nd century, they started the century being known as Nazarenes and ended up the century being known as Christians. In the 1st century, they ended up the century being known as Nazarenes, and they began the century being known as Jews. So you ought to expect some differences, not a total identity. That's the main conceptual difficulty, because we are somehow seduced, we are enchanted by the lovely thought that since we believe in God who is beyond history, and yet God who encounters us in history, scandalous though it may be, according to St. Paul, right? Scandalous though it may be, God encounters us in history. We are enchanted by that thought, and we forget that we remain historically conditioned beings. And history means that you change. A few of you are driving your father's Buick, either because it wasn't driven enough or because you've lovingly restored it. Most of us are not driving our father's Buick. Right? So it's also true of religion. And today we're going to look at a key example of how important change, or if you want the fancier word for that, development, important change is as much a part of religion as is continuity. In fact, religion and so many other things may be understood as a balance of tradition and change. Of course, we may debate where to put the fulcrum. And in fact, many of the debates within a religious community are based on exactly that. Where do you put the fulcrum to balance tradition and change? But that there must be some balance point, we ought to recognize. Okay, that's the main point in a preliminary sense that we need to understand clearly, because now we're going to talk about an important change in how people articulated their faith between the texts that are, say, 2,500 years ago, 2,500 years old, 3,000 years old, and the texts that are a mere 2,000 years old. Hey, listen, 500 years is a long time, right? Think about the English that was spoken in the days of Shakespeare, right? The fact that we've gone so far down the road may make it look at it this way. If you look at the mile markers in your rear view mirror, the mile markers from long ago, from far away, seem to be so close together. But really they're no closer together than the mile markers here. 500 years is a long time, whether it's 21st down to 16th century or whether it's 2,000 and 2,500 years ago. So there's a big change between the world of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the world of Philo-Judaeus, the world of the first authors of the Christian tradition. Big change in those 500 years. In particular, we're going to look at the basic question of what is a human after all? Ma Adam Vateda'ehu, says the psalmist in Psalm number 8. What is the human, O God, that you take note of him? Uven Adam vatifkedehu. What is it to be mortal, but nonetheless to be in relationship with God? That is, of course, the question of questions. Well, the Bible in the main, the Hebrew Bible in the main, and there are going to be a couple of exceptions, has the following notion that I can put in 2 words. You and I, my friends, are animated matter. That's what we are. Animated matter. And I'll explain this biblically with reference to the creation story of the first earthling, Adam. Earthling sounds so sci-fi, doesn't it? I'm saying earthling because the word Adam is like the word Adama, which means the earth, the ground. So, Genesis chapter 2, and I think you know the story. God makes the Adam from the dust of the earth. Right? That's the form. So it is God's gift of animating breath that gives life. So what happens at the end of life? Well, according to Psalm 104, here referring to animals, God creates the animals. When God takes away their breath, or literally yil kitun, when God harvests, collects back their breath, they return to their dust. So God animates and God deanimates matter. However, God doesn't want the world to be barren of life, according to Psalm 104, and so it says God animates afresh and the world is recreated. To which really our response should be, hallelujah. It's wondrous, it's awesome, it's inspiring to behold. Animated matter, both for humans and for other animal life. I'd like to point out that that is not a dualistic, that is rather a holistic sense of what is it to be human. It's also very much focused on this one lifespan. We live, our days come to an end. As a later rabbinic prayer says, Im ben shana yihyeh, o elef shanim yihyeh, ma yitron lo, kelo haya yihyeh. If man were to live for a year or a millennium, there still comes a time when he is not. What is the advantage of living the extra 999 years? It's still as if he is not. There's a less of a downer answer to that. But my point is that we are, according to this perspective, inherently finite. Inherently finite. That means that death is not a problem in a certain sense that it would be if we were inherently infinite. And in fact, there are different traditions about death in the Bible, but in chapter 6 of Genesis, God says, Lo yadun ruchi, God, my spirit will not, my ruach, my breath, my spirit, will not lodge forever in the human, b'shegam hu basar v'adam, because he is after all flesh and blood. And that's where we get the 120 years as the ideal maximum. And notice that Moses lives 120 years. So, in that sense, death is natural. That being the case, how do we look at the question of God's goodness in terms of human life? Well, the main texts of the Hebrew Bible look in terms of the nation. God in the Hebrew Bible is understood as a God of history, not just a God of nature. And as a God of history, God's workings are found in the events of history. The story of stories in the Hebrew Bible is a story of God's intervention on the side of deliverance and justice. God enters into the life of the Israelites. He defeats Pharaoh, or you could even say he defeats that which was worshipped as gods by all the Egyptians and by Pharaoh, and rescues the Israelites, delivers them from slavery unto freedom, leads them across the wilderness, settles them in the Promised Land. That's the main story of the Hebrew Bible, certainly of the Pentateuch and Joshua. So we look for national solutions to the question of where do you see God's goodness. That doesn't leave a lot of space for speculation about the posthumous destiny of you or me. So the focus, and these are linked, the focus is national, not individual, and the focus is this worldly, not something with a broader frame. Now, that's not all of the Hebrew biblical evidence. I'll give you two prominent exceptions to that rule. One exception is at the end of the book of 1 Samuel, where King Saul is very frustrated because he's on the eve of battle with the Philistines, and he can't discern God's will, and nothing is working. The dreams aren't working. The augurs aren't working. He's doing the Urim and Tumim, nothing's working. So he breaks his own law, and he has a necromancer, the Witch of Endor. Endor is a place in Israel. And for those of you who remember the 1960s sitcom Bewitched, now you know why the mother's name is Endora. Endora, because of the biblical reference, the Witch of Endor. And Saul comes disguised. He says, I want you to raise someone for me to speak to. And she says, well, don't you know it's forbidden? King Saul has prohibited it. She doesn't know she's speaking to King Saul. We have that a lot in the Bible. Judah doesn't know he's speaking to his brother Joseph when he's speaking to the Egyptian high official. And Saul says, no, nothing's going to happen to you, don't worry. And sure enough, it's Samuel, who is raised from the dead. We've been told that he's dead. And when I say raised, I mean that deliberately, because Samuel is not happy. And he says, why did you raise me? Leading to the thought that there was some belief in what we might properly call an underworld. In the Bible, this underworldly realm is often called Sheol. Sheol. But Sheol is mostly a place defined by absence. In Psalm number 30, the psalmist cries, in Sheol, who can acclaim you? It's a place where we don't have this relationship. It's defined more by absence than by presence. Another important exception to the rule is in Isaiah chapter 14, where the big bad king of Babylon is going down to Sheol, and all the secondary client kings get up from their seats and say, look at the big cheese, he's come to join us now. So there too, we have the notion that there is some sort of sentient survival, posthumous sentient survival. On the other hand, those two texts, I wouldn't call them intentionally dogmatic. They're trying to do other things. In the case of Saul, they're trying to explain his awareness of the hopelessness of his situation. On the morrow, he's going to go into battle, and he's going to die. And he does so. In a sense, Saul reminds me of Macbeth. Because Macbeth has learned that his opponent is the one whom the witches said will defeat him, right? Because he was untimely ripped from his mother's womb, right? It was a C-section. And till Burnham wood to Dunsinane, right? They had this little camouflage. They cut the boughs and the army moves, in its camouflage. So Macbeth knows that he's going to die because the prediction is being fulfilled, and he still brandishes his sword and he says, lay on, Macduff, right? And damned be he that cries, hold, enough. So he's going to meet his fate. That's my sense of what Saul is doing as well. He's crushed, but he's still going to go into battle. There's a tremendous pathos with the figure of King Saul, and you can understand that chapter in numerous ways. I don't think it's there primarily to teach us about views of the afterlife. Similarly, the polemic against Babylon involving the figure of the client kings who are scoffing, the big bad king who's now one of them, is more about justice than it is about some systematic or dogmatic teaching of the afterlife. By and large, the Hebrew Bible is silent about that big question. Adam is told he's going to return to his dust. Abraham is told he's going to be buried with his fathers and die at a very ripe old age. Even Moses, the one whom the book of Deuteronomy says was the greatest of all the prophets, he dies. And what is exceptional about his death is that God personally attends to his burial. Not that we are then said, oh, and he's seated at the side of God. It's not that. You know this idea about seated at the side of God, right? You've heard it? Okay, so you're going to like this. A German Shepherd and a Doberman Pinscher and a cat all arrive at the heavenly gate at the same moment. And God says to the three of them, the time has come to judge you. And the shepherd, I'm telling this for a reason. So God says, to judge you, I need to know what you truly believe. Now, I do know it, but I need to hear you say it. So the shepherd says, I truly believe in bravery and loyalty. And God says, that's admirable. Here, come sit at my right side. And then the Doberman says, I believe truly in defending my mistress or master, even if I have to sacrifice myself for the cause. God says, oh, that's just so awesome. Here, come sit at my left side. And God turns to the cat. And the cat says, I believe that you are sitting in my seat. I myself own cats and dogs and love them both, but it's the truth. So, nothing kills a joke like analyzing it. But since we're involved in the history of thought, what makes that joke funny, other than the psychology of cats and dogs, what makes that joke funny is that we have a long religious tradition of this notion of sitting at the side of Father God. And the joke is able to work within the parameters of that tradition. So that tradition, I'm telling you, has a starting point. And we're investigating its starting point. So the starting point, it turns out, is very late in the Hebrew biblical process. So again, just a brief orientation about chronology. We think that the core of the Hebrew Bible, the 5 books of Moses, the former prophets, the major prophets, the 12 minor prophets, that series of collections of important texts almost completely filled and edited, or we used to say this before the current governmental hoo-ha, redacted. We used to talk about redaction criticism, but now you're going to think I'm talking about something governmental. We used to say it's redacted by the 6th century before the Christian era. 2,500 years ago, most of the Hebrew Bible is as we have it now. But there's a little bit that's still getting filled in. One of the books that scholars think was filled in later is the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel, scholars say, is actually in 2 parts. The first half is a series of tales about a Jewish worthy of the era of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. But the second half already fits into what we call apocalyptic, using a famous old figure for the literary purpose of saying that the angel disclosed to this worthy what future history will look like. Now, whenever you have a work of apocalyptic, one way of figuring out when it's written is looking at when the predictions begin to get fuzzy and when they peter out altogether. So if I were to produce an apocalyptic today, which was the angel Gabriel appearing to George Washington and foretelling the future of the American Republic, I'd probably get everything spot on, or at least as well as my education allowed me to, until the early 21st century. Right? And then I'd be getting a little bit fuzzy, and then what I would say might prove to be wildly inaccurate. Right? Or else I might simply cut to the finish line. Right? Then there'll be a great conflagration and whatever. that kind of analysis allows us to look at the second half of the book of Daniel and date it to the period of persecutions of Jews by Antiochus IV, the Syrian Greek tyrant, also known to us from the books of the Maccabees and from lots and lots of Hallmark cards, around Hanukkah time. So, in that period, the book of Daniel, we have a remarkable assertion. Chapter 12, the first 3 verses. The angel tells Daniel, something else is going to happen in this important far future time period. Many of those who sleep in the dust will arise. Some for their long-deferred reward, some for their long-escaped humiliation and punishment. In other words, we have the notion of resurrection of the dead. Very important religious doctrine. I hardly have to argue that before a Christian audience, how important a religious doctrine it is. It makes its appearance here. Notice that the doctrine is not couched in universal terms. We're not speaking here in this text about the general resurrection. We're speaking about the resurrection of those who have something coming to them if we are to continue to believe in divine justice. Those who suffered martyrdom, those who failed to have justice done for them in the boundaries of this life, will have their just deserts finally served. Conversely, those who escape justice will not have escaped it forever. I'll tell you when that verse in the book of Daniel really spoke to me. At some point, I read that they thought that the arch-Nazi criminal Martin Bormann had died of old age in some South American fascist state. They believed that they'd found that he'd lived to the end of his days and died there. I don't know whether he did or not, but we do know that many high-ranking Nazis escaped to fascist states in South America, and just the thought that they escaped justice and lived to a ripe old age. I saw a movie not long ago called The German Doctor about the notorious Josef Mengele, the mass murderer in Auschwitz, among many other mass murderers, but he was particularly fiendish with his so-called medical experiments. The movie, The German Doctor, hinges on the point that the Israeli Mossad knew that they could apprehend only one of two, either Eichmann or Mengele, and the other one would immediately go to ground. I don't know if this is based on actual deliberations. It seems to me that it may have been. So they opted to apprehend Eichmann because his testimony would shed light on all the workings of the Holocaust. And in the movie, Mengele is aware of that, and he escapes just before they can get it, and lived out his days. So you want to believe in Daniel chapter 12, verse 3, when you think about Mengele avoiding justice. A few decades later, we have another book appearing, the second book of Maccabees. And in the 7th chapter of 2nd Maccabees, we have a story of a mother and her 7 sons. This story was much retold in the Jewish tradition throughout the Middle Ages. In the Sephardi literary tradition, Jews of Iberia and the Mediterranean basin, the woman gets a name. Her name is Hannah. So you may have seen Hannah and her 7 sons. But in 2nd Maccabees, she's not thus named. The woman and her 7 sons. Each son is tortured to death by the cruel tyrant because he won't transgress Jewish law. In that case, consuming the sacrificial pork that's being offered to the particular god of the tyrant Antiochus. Just by the way, if you look at the kosher code in Leviticus, again in Deuteronomy, pork is not more unkosher than camel, or rabbit, or rattlesnake, or raccoon, or gopher, just to mention some of the beloved foods in other cultures. And yet, we think of pork as the paradigmatically non-kosher food. Right? And some people believe, and there is something to this, that it was the historical experience of being compelled to consume pork as a way of betraying the covenant that led Jews to think of pork as the ne plus ultra of non-kosher food. I don't know. I've never had it, but I can tell you that whenever I have a group of students and we're doing an intro to world religions and I get to the kosher code, they shake their heads pityingly and they say, "Oh, Dr. Panitz, you don't know what you're missing." And I say, "You're quite right." You're quite right. I don't know what I'm missing. Sir?
So, as far as trichinosis is concerned, is there a relation to that?
Trichinosis? I don't think that the reason for prohibiting pork is hygienic originally. Although, if you want to talk about hygienic secondary gain, there's a lot of secondary gain from the biblical insistence that we not consume blood, which leads to the cooking of meat. And that probably saved more people from food poisoning than one species in particular. Now, the idea of resurrection of the dead retains the holistic notion of what is a human. You live, you die, you return. The same you returns, which, by the way, leads to a whole host of, is it the same you at this age, at that age, before you had your birthmark removed, after you had your birthmark removed, when you were at the weight that you lied about, all sorts of interesting questions, but that's for another time. The book of Daniel and the second book of Maccabees both have the appearance of being composed in the land of Israel. We have a different solution to the question of the unjust premature death in Jewish literature composed in the diaspora. Because here, and Alexandria, Egypt comes to mind, we spoke about this last week, here there's an intense cross-fertilization between Jewish culture and Hellenistic culture. So it's in the literature of those places at first, and then it spreads more widely, that we see this new, then it's new. Now it's not new, then it was new. As the Composers Forum says, remember, all music was once new. So religious ideas were once new also. So we have the then new idea that your immortal soul is the subject of the reward or the punishment. Your body dies at time X, but after that time, justice is done in terms of some essence of you, which we may now call the soul. So obviously, this solution to the burning existential problem of how can you believe in a God of justice when there is manifest injustice in the world? This solution presupposes a belief that the human is composed of body and soul. So where does this come from? If it doesn't come from the Bible, as we saw, by the way, it doesn't mean that Israelites of biblical era didn't have some such notion, but it means that it didn't pass through the editorial grid to become statements that are presented as teachings in the Bible. But where was this accepted as the way things are? And the answer is in Greek thought. Maybe not all of Greek thought. We have Homeric era Greek thought where we speak about Hades in a way that sounds a little bit like Sheol. But we then have, by the time of Plato and following, some very serious, high intellectual and philosophical assertions that we are composed in a dualistic sense of a soul and a body. And it's no longer that you are animated matter, to go back to my earlier formulation. Now, if we want to answer the question, well, what are we? The answer becomes embodied soul. Can you hear the difference between animated matter and embodied soul? If you are embodied soul, then the noun in that noun phrase is soul. In a sense, that becomes essential. And why shouldn't it be essential? It's more long-lasting. Now, there's some debates about whether it's truly eternal or whether it just doesn't wear out as quickly as the body. That's one of the objections in Plato's beautiful and enchanting dialogue, Phaedo, where one of the disciples says, well, okay, Socrates, you've proven that the soul lasts longer than the body, but maybe it wears out like my favorite coat. After 10 bodies or some finite number of bodies, the soul's gone too. And Socrates says, I'm glad you asked that, and proceeds to give a good answer before he quaffs the hemlock, right? In full confidence. Right? So the movement in Greek thought was to demonstrate, to assert and to demonstrate that we do have a soul, and then it's defined in various ways, but the important thing is that the soul is eternal. Why is it eternal? There's different arguments for why it's eternal. It's eternal because it's a simple substance. It has no moving parts that can break. It can't decompose. Your body can decompose. Your soul can't decompose, and so on and so forth. Your soul becomes connected in this Greek mode of thinking with your cognitive and with your moral faculties. And here we see how the doctrine of soul is easily adaptable to religious thinking. Because to point out that Jewish thinkers imported the idea of the soul, it's not enough that the idea should have been popular. It also had to have been congruent with Jewish thought in at least some ways for it to get through the grid and become assimilated. And here it's easy to see how. God addresses us. God tells us to do this and don't do that. Right? It's almost like the diet book that I saw. I've seen many diet books, unfortunately. Eat this, not that. Right? You know that book? Eat this, not that. Well, that's the first things that God tells us, right? No, the very first thing God tells us is a blessing, be fruitful and multiply. But not long after that, God tells us, eat this, not that. So that means that we're supposed to be able to hear and obey. That's what the Israelites said at Mount Sinai. We hear and we obey. Actually, they said we obey and we hear, which that's a whole other sermon. But we hear and we obey. That means we have the faculty to hear and the faculty to obey. So once we want to map out this Greek notion of your soul and its relationship to your body, the fact that in the Bible we are understood to be creatures capable of knowing up to a point and capable of choosing based on our knowledge, that allows for this foreign idea to become assimilated and actually fairly easily. That's what we see in this book, The Wisdom of Solomon, and that's really its main contribution to the ongoing development of religious thought. So in the balance of our time, I'm going to show you a few of the key verses. So just going to run through it quickly. In the very first chapter of The Wisdom of Solomon, verses 12 through 16, let me read you David Winston's translation of it. we are being exhorted, actually the rulers of the world are being exhorted. Do not court death through a deviant way of life, nor draw down destruction by your own actions. For God, listen to this claim, it's pretty interesting. For God did not make death. God did not make death. Good question, Emily. Nor does he take delight in the destruction of the living. He created all things that they might endure. All that has come into existence preserves its being, and there is no deadly poison in it. Death's rulership is not on earth, for justice is immortal. Well, Professor Winston, who gave us a very fine commentary on the Wisdom of Solomon, published by the Anchor Bible series, says that here the author is referring to spiritual death. God did not create your spirit to be mortal. God created your spirit to be immortal, but wicked people don't get that switch turned on. Wicked people don't achieve a blissful immortality because of the wrong choices that they've made. So, why do they make that mistake? Chapter 2, verse 22 and following. I'll start at 21. The wicked people. So they argued and were misled, blinded by their malice. They were ignorant of God's mysteries. They entertained no hope that holiness would have its reward, and passed up the prize of unblemished souls. But God created man for immortality, and made him an image of his own proper being. So here's your answer. It was through the devil's envy that death entered into the cosmic order, and they who are his own experience him. John Milton, here we come. See that? So death is the work of the archfiend. Now that's not the Satan of the book of Job. It's certainly not the Satan of the book of Zechariah, where he's simply the prosecuting attorney. It's not the angel who stands in the way of Bilam, when Bilam is coming on his donkey, Lisitno, to be his adversary, to oppose him. So here we see at this point, relatively new development in the thought of transcendent evil. And it's connected to this notion of death. Now, one of the great problems is what to do if you want to vindicate divine justice when confronted with a premature death. We have this routinely. We go to funerals, a 97-year-old person has reached the end of their course, and we offer as words of consolation, well, they lived a long life, right? By the way, their 72-year-old child has just become an orphan. So there is that too. Don't forget, right? If we were orphaned by age 35 and we're beholding someone who's orphaned at age 72, they're still going through that loss at that moment. But we offer as consolation that someone's lived a long life. But we don't have that consolation when someone dies prematurely. So the Wisdom of Solomon's author takes that up in chapter 4. Even premature death is not a refutation of God's justice. And here there are a number of interesting thoughts given relative to the biblical antediluvian figure of Enoch. Hanoch lived a very short life by the standards of Genesis chapter 5. You know, everyone else is living 900 some years, 800 some years. He is taken, interesting word, he is taken at the junior age of 365. Again, who knows what these numbers mean, but I know that 365 is considerably less than 900, right? By the way, the folklorist Robert Graves, great poet also and dramatist, Robert Graves thinks that there's something of a solar mythological hero attached to the figure of Hanoch, and that's why it's 365. We really can't go much beyond that except to say it's intriguing. So why was Hanoch taken early? Well, one of the theories is given to us by the author here. Because God didn't want him to be corrupted and to lose the reward that so far he was given. Imagine this. You're in the football game. You're in the title game. You're winning at halftime. And God says, okay, we'll end the game here because we know you. You're the Redskins. You always lose in the fourth quarter. When my boys were little, we would watch the Redskins game on Sunday afternoon, and I couldn't bear it. It was just too painful. But I knew that if they weren't winning by 14 points at the beginning of the fourth quarter, they had lost. And already I'd go back to whatever lecture I had to prepare. And then at the end of the game, I could tell by the heavy atmosphere in the room that indeed had happened. So imagine deciding to end the game at halftime because we don't want our boy to lose. It sounds a little bit like we're gaming the system here, right? But that's the argument. He would have lost his chance at a blissful immortality if he'd hung around a little bit longer, because flesh is corruptible, temptation is ever present, and God did him a favor by taking him early. You know that because you've heard the consolation offered, oh, it's the good who die young. Right? So this is where these ideas come, well, I don't know if it's where they come from, it's where they find their first expression. Now, as a final point, how does this argument fit in with the overarching theme of wisdom that we have been studying? And the answer for this is a very beautiful chain that we find in chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. Let me finish by reading that to you. It's really very beautiful. The true beginning of wisdom is the desire to learn, and a concern for loving is love for her being Sophia, Chokhmah, wisdom. Love for her means the keeping of her laws. That we know from the wisdom of Ben Sirach, right? And we also know this from Proverbs chapter 3. We've studied those. And now, attention to the law is a surety of immortality. That's what's new here. And immortality makes one near to God. A beautiful chain. See that? So this is how the idea of immortality is connected to our overarching theme of wisdom. And we got a long way to go yet. But I hope you've enjoyed this part of the journey. Thank you.